Is that too loud? How's that? Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Okay. Thanks.
I'm not going to do the professor thing where I glare at the students in the front row as they talk. Greetings of peace and power to everybody that is assembled in this gathering. Delighted to kick off this event, The End of Empire and the Future of Freedom. Over the next 3 days, we are going to be having a conversation about the future of anti-imperialist struggle, and we have an auspicious keynote speaker to open the proceedings tonight. I'll introduce him in just a second. First, I want to do a bit of ground clearing. This event is made possible by funding from the Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences through my research initiative, which goes by the name ISRAR, the Initiative for the Study of Race, Religion, and Revolution. I founded this center when I arrived at UCSB almost 6 years ago, and there's some familiar faces in the room that have participated in previous ISRAR events, and welcome in and welcome back to those that have been a part of this conversation, and welcome into all of the auspicious guests that are in the room. I'm going to read quickly the conference abstract because it sets the stage for the upcoming conversations over the next 3 days. All empires fall. Across all our faiths and philosophies, this truth holds as universal law. American imperialism will be no exception to this rule, and we may well be witnessing the extinction burst of what is without a doubt the most dangerous instrument of surveillance and death dealing that has ever come into existence in human history. It is a source of almost infinite surveillance, subjugation, and extraction. Will the American state survive its imperial demise? That's where the future of freedom comes in. If you believe that across all our faiths and philosophies that this is a simple truth, that nothing that exists by might and by force is eternal, if you believe that all empires fall, then the question becomes, what will replace the imperium? What comes after the fall of empire? Many of us have been moving as if the end of empire is impossible. But in fact, the end of empire is inevitable. The most pressing questions become not about what is in our past or even what is in front of us in this moment, but rather what is in front of us in the future. What kind of future of freedom do we build? And we better get to building it now because the institutions and conversations and structures that one creates through the process of transformational revolutionary struggle, those are the institutions that we are going to inherit on the other side of the inevitable collapse of this doomed empire. So as I said, when the collapse of empire is recognized not as impossible but as inevitable, then a simple question must be posed: what do we build on the imperium's ashes? America has long promised freedom to its people, only to fall woefully short in keeping its word. In this 3-day conference, we are bringing together academics, artists, and activists to plot the course towards liberation. And we begin tonight with our opening keynote with Chris Hedges. I'm going to say a few words of introduction for a person who should need no introduction, award-winning journalist, in many ways a voice of moral integrity and clarity for our time. In 1990, Chris was covering the Gulf War when he was arrested by the Army for refusing to abide by the protocols for embedded reporters. In 1991, still doing coverage of the Gulf War, Saddam Hussein put a bounty out on Chris's head. So already, brother, you had me at hello. If you got the Army coming after you on one hand and Saddam coming after you on the other, you are doing a lot of things right. Covered Sarajevo during the war. And I should have added courage to integrity in my introduction of Chris, because under fire, under bombing, in a war zone, continuing to cover with courage and integrity, physical courage, of course, but also moral courage, the courage to speak truth to power, even if it's going to land you in hot water. He covered the genocidal massacre in Srebrenica. He won a Pulitzer Prize with his team at the New York Times for his coverage of Al-Qaeda. And many of you will have seen the footage of in 2003 at the Rockford College commencement, they cut his microphone off because of his vociferous critique of the war in Iraq. This was the beginning of the imperialist assault on Chris's reputation that would lead to the parting of ways with the Times in 2005. Since then, Chris has been teaching inmates, publishing independently, publishing the Chris Hedges report. Every time one drops on YouTube, I'm the first person to watch it, and don't anybody argue that point with me. I know many of you, might think you're the quickest one to hit click on that, but if it's Brianna Joy Gray or Chris Hedges, I'm the first one to hit click. I'm just letting you guys know. Teaching inmates, teaching the people. And that is a cursory introduction of this Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist and author. But I'm going to close this introduction with the reason why I invited Chris to give this opening keynote. Even though I know that Friday's a travel day and no one comes to the opening keynote, I still wanted to make sure he was here because this was the only day that he could be here. He flies out overseas tomorrow. And the reason why I invited Chris was two things that he said about our current crisis in imperialism, our current moment of American genocidal excess. And Chris and I haven't talked about this, but I'll explain what these two things were. He gave a talk, and I'm forgetting off of the top of my head where this talk was, where he developed this beautiful argument that is summarized in the following dictum. If we do not take action, soon we will all be Palestinians. He laid out the case for the permission structure that we are bringing into being if we do not take immediate action to end this genocide. And he punctuated that talk with the emphatic statement that if we do not end this genocide, if we demonstrate to these people that they can do this to us and we will not protest, not only will we not protest, but we will affirm. We will enter into voting booths and select our genociders. That we will be teaching them that there is no line that they cannot cross. And as James Baldwin put it, of course I have to speak up, because if they come for you in the morning, they will come for me by evening. If you had no compassion whatsoever for the Palestinian people in their struggle, and you obviously should, but if you had no compassion for the Palestinian people in their struggle for liberation, then you should at least have enough of a self-preservation instinct to know that if you give this permission structure to a state that has this kind of surveillance capacity and robot dogs with machine gun turrets attached to them, drones that can reach into every corner, sooner or later, we will all be Palestinians. That was the one that grabbed my attention. The one that brought me to my knees was Nero's guests. When Chris reminded us that in a previous corrupt, murderous imperium, that of Rome, when it was in its final stages of imperial collapse, we all know the expression, Nero fiddled while Rome burned. But how many of us are aware that the crucifixions were not just visited upon brown-skinned Jewish Palestinians, but crucifixions were visited upon every opponent of the imperium, everybody who dared to exercise their right to speak against Caesar. So Chris reminded us in this extraordinary lecture that some of those crucifixions were live burnings, that Nero, the hedonist, would hold dinner parties inside his castle where he would light crucified human beings aflame. They became the candle by which others ate and feasted. So when we saw tents with human beings incinerated alive, I was reminded of Chris's talk about Nero's guests, because we understand the kind of genocidal dissociative disorder that might set in to people that have that kind of power. But what of the dinner guests? At what point do those who come and frequent the court of such a tyrant, who dine by the firelight kindled with human flesh, at what point do they become more a moral monster than the genocidal Caesar, than the genocidal Pharaoh, than the genocidal Nimrod, than the genocidal American? At what point do we as witnesses, as those who continue to consume by this unholy firelight, at what point do we exceed even Caesar in our moral depravity? This is the voice of intellectual and journalistic courage, integrity, and humanity that is Chris Hedges. Without any further ado, I invite him to the stage.
Extermination works at first. This is the terrible lesson of history. If Israel is not stopped, and no outside power appears willing to halt the genocide in Gaza or the destruction of Lebanon, Israel will achieve its goals of depopulating and annexing northern Gaza. It will turn Gaza, southern Gaza, into a charnel house where Palestinians are burned alive, decimated by bombs, and die from starvation and infectious diseases until they are driven out. It will achieve its goal of destroying Lebanon. 2,400 people have been killed and over 1.2 million Lebanese have been displaced in an attempt to turn it into a failed state. And it is already turning its genocidal fury on the West Bank. It may realize its long-cherished dream of forcing the United States into a war with Iran. Israeli leaders are publicly salivating over the proposal to assassinate the Iranian leader and carry out airstrikes on Iran's nuclear installations and oil facilities. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and his cabinet, like those driving Middle East policy in the White House, Anthony Blinken, raised in a staunch Zionist household, Brett McGurk, Amos Hochstein, who was born in Israel and served in the Israeli military, and Jake Sullivan, are true believers in the doctrine that violence can mold the world to fit their demented vision. That this doctrine has been a spectacular failure in Israel's occupied territories and did not work in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, and Libya, and a generation earlier in Vietnam, does not deter them. This time, they assure us it will succeed. In the short term, they are right. And this is not good news for the Palestinians or the Lebanese. The U.S. and Israel will continue to use their arsenal of industrial weapons to kill huge numbers of people and turn cities into rubble. But in the long term, this indiscriminate violence sows dragon's teeth. It creates adversaries that sometimes a generation later outdo in savagery, we call it terrorism, what was done to those slain in the previous generation. Hate and a lust for vengeance, as I learned covering the war in the former Yugoslavia, are passed down like a poisonous elixir from one generation to the next. Our disastrous interventions in Afghanistan, Syria, Iraq, Libya, and Yemen, along with Israel's invasion of Lebanon in 1982, which created Hezbollah, should have taught us this. But this is a lesson that is never learned. How, for example, could the Bush administration imagine it would be greeted as liberators in Iraq when the U.S. had spent over a decade imposing sanctions that resulted in severe shortages of food and medicine, causing the deaths of at least 1 million Iraqis, including 500,000 children. Israel's occupation of Palestine and the saturation bombing of Lebanon in 1982 were the catalyst for Osama bin Laden's attack on the Twin Towers in New York City in 2001, along with U.S. support for attacks on Muslims in Somalia, Chechnya, Kashmir, and the south of the Philippines, as well as U.S. military assistance to Israel and the sanctions on Iraq. I see nothing to halt Israel, especially since the Israel lobby has bought and paid for Congress and the two ruling parties, as well as cowing the media and universities. There's money to be made in war, a lot of it. And the influence of the war industry, buttressed by the hundreds of millions of dollars spent on political campaigns by the Zionists, is a formidable barrier to peace, not to mention sanity. Israel has been poisoned by the psychosis of permanent war. It has been morally bankrupted by the sanctification of victimhood, which it uses to justify an occupation that is even more savage than that of apartheid South Africa. Its democracy, which was always exclusively for Jews, has been hijacked by extremists who are pushing the country towards fascism. Human rights campaigners, intellectuals, journalists, Israeli and Palestinian, are subject to constant state surveillance, arbitrary arrests, and government-run smear campaigns. Israel's educational system, starting in primary school, is an indoctrination machine for the military, and the greed and corruption of its venal political and economic elite have created vast income disparities that mirror the decay within America's democracy, along with a culture of anti-Arab and anti-black racism. By the time Israel achieves its decimation of Gaza, and Israel is talking about months more of warfare, its facade of civility, its supposed vaunted respect for the rule of law and democracy, its mythical story of the courageous Israeli military and miraculous birth of the Jewish nation, which it successfully sold to its Western audiences, will lie in ash heaps. Israel's social capital will be spent. It will be revealed as the ugly, repressive, hate-filled apartheid regime it always has been, alienating younger generations of American Jews. Its patron, the United States, as new generations come into power, will distance itself from Israel. Its popular support will come from reactionary Zionists and America's Christianized fascists who see Israel's domination of ancient biblical land as a harbinger of the second coming, and in its subjugation of Arabs, a kindred racism and celebration of white supremacy. Israel will become synonymous with its victims, the way the Turks are synonymous with the Armenians, the Germans with the Namibians, and later the Jews, and the Serbs are with the Bosniaks. Israel's cultural, artistic, journalistic, and intellectual life will atrophy. Israel will be a stagnant nation where the religious fanatics, bigots, and Jewish extremists who have seized power will dominate public discourse. And it will join the club of the globe's most despotic regimes. Despotisms can exist long after their past due date, but they are terminal. Nations need more than force to survive. They need a mystique. This mystique provides purpose, civility, and even nobility to inspire citizens to sacrifice for the nation. The mystique offers hope for the future. It provides meaning. It provides national identity. And when mystiques implode, when they are exposed as lies, a central foundation of state power collapses. All Israel has left is escalating savagery, including torture and lethal violence against unarmed civilians. The Israeli military has carried out, according to the UN, since October 7th, 93 massacres in Gaza. This wholesale violence works in the short term as it did in the war waged by the French in Algeria, the dirty war in Argentina, the British occupation of India, Egypt, Kenya, and Northern Ireland, and the American occupations of Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan. But in the long term, they are all suicidal. The genocide in Gaza has turned Hamas resistance fighters into heroes in the global south. And Israel has killed hundreds of Palestinian leaders, including Yahya Sinwar. It assassinated Dr. Abdul Aziz al-Rantisi, one of the founders of Hamas, who I knew, and Halil al-Wazir, known as Abu Jihad, who founded the PLO with Yasser Arafat, who I also knew. But the daily humiliation, forced impoverishment, indiscriminate violence, long prison terms, and torture is fertile training ground for resistance leaders. The long struggle for freedom by the Palestinians has made this point over and over and over. Run, the Israelis demand of the Palestinians in Gaza. Run for your lives. Run from Rafah, the way you ran from Gaza City, the way you ran from Jabalia, the way you ran from Deir al-Bala, the way you ran from Beit Hanun, the way you ran from Han Yunis. Run, or we will kill you. We will drop GBU-39 bombs on your tent encampments and set them ablaze. We will spray you with bullets from our machine gun-equipped drones. We will pound you with artillery and tank shells. We will shoot you down with snipers. We will decimate your tents, your refugee camps, your cities and towns, your homes, your schools, your hospitals, and your water purification plants. We will rain death from the sky. Run for your lives again and again and again. Pack up the few belongings you have left, blankets, a couple of pots, some clothes. We don't care how exhausted you are, how hungry you are, how terrified you are, how sick you are, how old or how young you are. Run, run, run. And when you run in terror to one part of Gaza, we will make you turn around and run to another, trapped in a labyrinth of death, back and forth, up and down, side to side, 7, 8, 9, 10 times. We toy with you like mice in a trap. Then we deport you so you can never return, or we kill you. Let the world denounce our genocide. What do we care? The billions in military aid flows unchecked from our American ally. The fighter jets, the artillery shells, the tanks, the bombs, an endless supply. We killed children by the thousands. We killed women and the elderly by the thousands. The sick and injured without medicine, and hospitals die. We poison the water. We cut off the food. We make you starve. We created this hell. We are the masters. Law, duty, a code of conduct, they do not exist for us. But first we toy with you. We humiliate you. We terrorize you. We revel in your fear. We are amused by your pathetic attempts to survive. You are not human. You are creatures, Untermensch. We feed our lust for domination. Look at our posts on social media. They have gone viral. One shows soldiers grinning in a Palestinian house with the owners tied up and blindfolded in the background. We loot rugs, cosmetics, motorbikes, jewelry, watches, cash, gold, antiquities. We mock your misery. We cheer your death. We celebrate our religion, our nation, our identity, our superiority by negating and erasing yours. Depravity is moral. Atrocity is heroism. Genocide is redemption. This is the game of terror played by Israel in Gaza. It was the game played during the dirty war in Argentina, which I covered as a reporter when the military junta disappeared 30,000 of its own citizens. That disappeared were subject to torture, and who cannot call what is happening to the Palestinians in Gaza torture, and humiliated before they were murdered. It was the game played in the clandestine torture centers and prisons I reported on in El Salvador and later Iraq. It is what I saw in the Serbian concentration camps in Bosnia. Israeli journalist Yanon Magal on the Ha Patriotim show on Israel's Channel 14 joked that Joe Biden's red line was the killing of 30,000 Palestinians. The singer Kobe Perez asked if this was the number of dead for a day. The audience erupted in applause and laughter. We know Israel's intent. Annihilate the Palestinians the same way the United States annihilated Native Americans. The Australians annihilated First Nations peoples. The Germans annihilated the Herero. The Turks, the Armenians, the Nazis, the Jews. The specifics are different, but the goal is the same, erasure, and we cannot plead ignorance. But of course, it is easier to pretend. Pretend Israel will allow humanitarian aid. Pretend there will be a permanent ceasefire. Pretend Palestinians will return to their destroyed homes in Gaza. Pretend Gaza will be rebuilt, the hospitals, the universities, the mosques, the housing. Pretend the Palestinian Authority will administer Gaza. Pretend there will be a two-state solution. Pretend there is no genocide. The vaunted democratic values, morality, and respect for human rights claimed by Israel and the United States has, of course, always been a lie. The real credo is this: we have everything, and if you try and take it away from us, we will kill you. People of color, especially when they are poor and vulnerable, do not count. The hopes, dreams, dignity, and aspirations for freedom of those outside the empire are worthless. Global domination will be sustained through racialized violence. The lie that the American empire is predicated on democracy and liberty is one the Palestinians and those in the global South, as well as Native Americans and black and brown Americans, not to mention those who live in the Middle East, have known for decades. But it is a lie that still has currency in the United States and Israel, a lie used to justify the unjustifiable. We do not halt Israel's genocide because we as Americans are Israel, infected with the same white supremacy and intoxicated by our domination of the globe's wealth and the power to obliterate others with our advanced weaponry. U.S. occupation forces in Iraq and Afghanistan, replicating, of course, what they did in Vietnam, deliberately maimed, abused, beat, tortured, raped, wounded, and killed hundreds of thousands of unarmed civilians, including children, and carried out, like Israel, targeted assassinations. After the Vietnam War, Nick Turse writes, most scholars wrote off the accounts of widespread war crimes that recur throughout Vietnamese revolutionary publications and American anti-war literature as merely so much propaganda. Few academic historians even thought to cite such sources, and almost none did so extensively. Meanwhile, My Lai came to stand for and thus blot out all other American atrocities. Vietnam War bookshelves are now filled with big picture histories, sober studies of diplomacy and military tactics, and combat memoirs told from the soldier's perspective. Buried and forgotten U.S. government archives, locked away in the memories of atrocity survivors, the real American war in Vietnam has all but vanished from public consciousness. Historical amnesia is a vital part of extermination campaigns once they end, at least for the victors. But for the victims, the memory of genocide, along with a yearning for retribution, is a sacred calling. The vanquished reappear in ways the genocidal killers cannot predict, fueling new conflicts and new animosities. The physical eradication of all Palestinians, the only way genocide ever works, is an impossibility, given that 6 million Palestinians alone live in the diaspora and over 5 million live in Gaza and the West Bank. Israel's genocide has enraged the 1.9 billion Muslims worldwide, as well as most of the global South. It has discredited and weakened the corrupt and fragile regimes of the dictatorships and monarchies in the Arab world, home to 456 million Muslims who collaborate with the U.S. and Israel, and has fueled the ranks of the Palestinian resistance. What is happening in Gaza, of course, is not unprecedented. Indonesia's military, backed by the U.S., carried out a year-long campaign in 1965 to exterminate those accused of being communist leaders, functionaries, party members, and sympathizers. The bloodbath, most of it carried out by death squads and paramilitary groups, decimated the labor union movement along with the intellectual and artistic class, opposition parties, university student leaders, journalists, and ethnic Chinese. 1 million people were slaughtered. Many of the bodies were dumped into rivers, hastily buried, or left to rot on roadsides. And this campaign of mass murder is today mythologized in Indonesia, as it will be in Israel. It is portrayed as an epic battle against the forces of evil, just as Israel equates the Israel slaughter, what the sociologist James William Gibson calls techno-war, defines Israel's assault on Gaza and Lebanon. Techno-war is centered on the concept of overkill. Overkill, with its intentionally large numbers of civilian casualties, is justified as an effective form of deterrence. It is what Israel cynically calls mowing the lawn in Gaza. Incursion on October 7th by Hamas and other resistance groups, which left 1,154 Israelis, tourists, and migrant workers dead, and saw 240 people taken hostage, gave Israel the pretext for what it has long craved, the erasure of Palestinians. Israel has now damaged or destroyed all of Gaza's universities, nearly all of its educational facilities, and its 13 major libraries. It has destroyed at least 195 heritage sites, including 208 mosques, churches, and Gaza's central archives that held 150 years of historical records and documents. Israeli warplanes, missiles, tanks, drones, artillery shells, and naval guns pulverize Gaza as I speak, which is only 20 miles long and 5 miles wide, in a scorched earth campaign unlike anything seen since the war in Vietnam. It has dropped 25,000 tons of explosives, the equivalent of 2 nuclear bombs on Gaza, many of these targets selected by artificial intelligence. It drops unguided missiles, dumb bombs, and 2,000-pound bunker buster bombs on refugee camps and densely packed urban centers, as well as the so-called safe zones. 42% of Palestinians have been killed while sheltering in safe zones. Over 1.9 million Palestinians have been displaced from their homes, forced to find refuge in UNRWA shelters, hospital corridors and courtyards, schools, tents, or in the open air, living next to fetid pools of raw sewage. The blockade of northern Gaza has left over 400,000 Palestinians enduring a starvation siege and constant airstrikes in an attempt to depopulate the north. Israeli forces have killed 1,250 Palestinians in this assault launched on October 5th, and reports from northern Gaza, of course, are difficult to obtain as internet and phone services have been cut and the few journalists on the ground have been denounced as Hamas members and targeted for murder. Civil defense units say they have been barred by Israeli forces from reaching most of the sites of the strikes, and their crews have been attacked. Israel has killed at least 42,000 Palestinians in Gaza, including 13,000 children and 9,000 women. It has wounded close to 100,000 others, many with life-crippling injuries. It has killed at least 136 journalists, many, if not most of them, deliberately targeted. It has killed 340 doctors, nurses, and other health workers, 4% of Gaza's healthcare personnel. 233 UNRWA workers have been killed in Gaza since October 7th. That's the highest death toll in UN history. And these numbers do not begin to reflect the actual death toll, since only those dead registered in morgues and hospitals, most of which no longer function, are counted. The death toll, when those who are missing are counted, is far, far above 40,000. At the same time, Gaza has been turned into a toxic wasteland. Nearly 40 million tons of debris, including unexploded ordnance and human remains, contaminate the ecosystem. More than 140 temporary waste sites and 340,000 tons of waste, untreated wastewater, and sewage overflow ensure the spread of diseases such as hepatitis A, respiratory infections, diarrhea, and skin diseases. And in a further blow, the Israeli parliament last Monday, approved a bill to ban UNRWA, a lifeline for Palestinians in Gaza, from operating on Israeli territory and areas under Israel's control. This ban almost certainly ensures the collapse of aid distribution already crippled in Gaza. Israel has expanded its buffer zone along the Gaza perimeter to 16% of the territory, in the process leveling homes, apartment blocks, and farms. It has pushed over 84% of the 2.3 million people in Gaza into, the UN writes, a shrinking, unsafe humanitarian zone covering 12.6% of a territory now reconfigured in preparation for annexation. And satellite imagery indicates that the Israeli military has built roads and military bases in over 26% of Gaza, again in the words of the UN, suggesting the aim of a permanent presence. Israel plays linguistic tricks to deny anyone in Gaza the status of civilians, and any building, including mosques, hospitals, and schools, protected status. Palestinians are all branded as responsible for the attack on October 7th or written off as human shields for Hamas. All structures are considered legitimate targets by Israel because they are allegedly Hamas command centers or said to harbor Hamas fighters. These accusations, Francesca Albanese, the UN Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in the Palestinian territories, writes, are a pretext used to justify the killing of civilians under a cloak of purported legality. In August, Albanese writes in her most recent report, entry permits for humanitarian organizations nearly halved. Access to water has been restricted to a quarter of pre-October 7th levels. Approximately 93% of the agricultural, forestry, and fishing economies have been destroyed. 95% of Palestinians face high levels of acute food insecurity and deprivation for decades to come. In recent months, 83% of food aid was prevented from entering Gaza, and the civilian police in Rafah were repeatedly targeted, shot, impairing distribution. At least 34 deaths from malnutrition were recorded by September of this year. These measures, she notes, indicate an intent to destroy its population through starvation. Of course, the occupation and genocide would not be sustained without the U.S., which gives Israel $3.8 billion a year in military assistance. The U.S. has spent $17.9 billion on military aid to Israel in the last 12 months, including providing massive 2,000-pound bombs and fighter jets. This, too, is our genocide. This genocide, of course, is the accumulation of a process. It's not an act. It is the predictable denouement of Israel's settler colonial project. It is coded within the DNA of the Israeli apartheid state. It is where Israel had to end up, and Zionist leaders are open about their goals. We do not halt Israel's genocide because we are Israel. If you remember the New York Times columnist Thomas Friedman telling Charlie Rose on the eve of the war in Iraq that American soldiers should go house to house from Basra to Baghdad and say to Iraqis, suck on this. And this, of course, is the real credo of the American empire. As climate change imperils survival, as resources become scarce, as migration becomes an imperative for millions, as agricultural yields decline, as coastal areas are flooded, as droughts and wildfires proliferate, as states fail, as armed resistance movements rise to battle their oppressors along with their proxies, genocide will not be an anomaly. It will be the norm. The earth's vulnerable and poor, those Frantz Fanon called the wretched of the earth, will be the next Palestinians. And the scorched earth tactics we see in Gaza and Lebanon are becoming common in the West Bank. Thousands of Palestinians in West Bank towns such as Jenin, Nablus, Qalqilia, and Tulkarm live for days under curfew, making it difficult to access food and water. As in Gaza, the Israeli army targets ambulances, blocks entrances to hospitals, and bulldozes streets and electricity and public health infrastructure. Drones and warplanes carry out airstrikes. Israeli roadblocks, checkpoints, and blockades make travel difficult or impossible. and Israel has suspended financial transfers to the Palestinian Authority, which nominally governs the West Bank in collaboration with Israel. It has revoked 148,000 work permits for those who once had jobs in Israel. The gross domestic product of the West Bank has contracted by 22.7%. Nearly 30% of businesses have closed, and 292,000 jobs have been lost. Over 692 Palestinians, that's 10 times the previous 14 years' annual average of 69 fatalities, have been killed, and more than 5,000 have been injured. Of the 169 Palestinian children who have been killed in the West Bank, nearly 80% were shot in the head or the torso. Albanese's report dismisses the claim that Israel is carrying out the assault in Gaza and the West Bank to defend itself, eradicate Hamas, or bring the hostages home, charging that these claims are a camouflage, a way of invisibilizing the crime. Genocide, as Judge Dalvir Bandari, he's not Brazilian, from the ICJ, International Court of Justice, points out, may exist simultaneously with other ulterior motives. Egypt and the other Arab states have refused to consider accepting Palestinian refugees, but Israel is banking on creating a humanitarian disaster of such catastrophic proportions that these countries or other countries will relent so they can depopulate Gaza and turn their attention to ethnically cleansing the West Bank. This is the plan, the intent, although no one, including Israel, knows if it will work. There is only one way to end the ongoing genocide in Gaza, and it is not through bilateral negotiations. Israel has amply demonstrated, including with the assassination of the lead Hamas negotiator, Ismail Haniyeh, that it has no interest in a permanent ceasefire. The only way for Israel's genocide of the Palestinians to be halted is for the U.S. to end all weapons shipments to Israel. And the only way this will take place is if enough Americans make clear that they have no intention of supporting any presidential ticket or any political party that fuels genocide. The arguments against a boycott of the two ruling parties are familiar. It will ensure the election of Trump. Harris has rhetorically shown more compassion. There are not enough of us to have an impact. We can work within the Democratic Party. The Israel lobby, or AIPAC, which owns most of Congress, is too powerful. Negotiations will eventually achieve a ceasefire. But in short, this says we are impotent and must surrender our agency to sustain a project of mass killing. We must accept as normal governance the shipment of billions of dollars in military aid to an apartheid state, the use of vetoes at the UN Security Council to protect Israel, and the active obstruction of international efforts to end mass murder. We have no choice. But genocide, the internationally recognized crime of crimes, is not a policy issue. It cannot be equated with trade deals, infrastructure bills, charter schools, or immigration. It is a moral issue. It is about the eradication of a people. And any surrender to genocide condemns us as a nation and as a species. It plunges the global society one step closer to barbarity. It eviscerates the rule of law. It mocks every fundamental value we claim to honor. It is in a category by itself. And to not, with every fiber of our being, combat genocide is to be complicit in what Hannah Arendt defines as radical evil. The evil where human beings, as human beings, are rendered superfluous. The fundamental lesson of the Holocaust, which writers such as Primo Levi stress, is that we can all become willing executioners It takes very little. I saw this in every war I covered. We can all become complicit, if only through indifference and apathy. Monsters exist, Levy, who survived Auschwitz, writes, but they are too few in number to be truly dangerous. More dangerous are the common men and women, the functionaries, ready to believe and to act without asking questions. To confront evil, even if there is no chance of success, keeps alive our humanity and dignity. It allows us, as Václav Havel writes, to live in truth. A truth the powerful do not want spoken and seek to suppress. It provides a guiding light to those who come after us. It tells the victims they are not alone. It is humanity's revolt against an enforced position and an attempt to regain control over one's sense of responsibility. What does it say about us if we accept a world where we arm and fund a nation that kills and wounds hundreds of innocent people a day? What does it say about us if we support an orchestrated famine and the poisoning of the water supply where the polio virus has been detected, meaning tens of thousands of people will get sick and many will die? What does it say about us if we permit, for over 12 months, the bombing of refugee camps, hospitals, villages, and cities to wipe out families and force survivors to camp out in the open or find shelter in crude tents? What does it say about us when we accept the murder of over 11,000 children, although this is surely an undercount? What does it say about us when we watch Israel escalate attacks on UN facilities, schools, including the Al-Ta'abain school in Gaza City, where over 100 Palestinians were killed while performing the Fajr, or dawn prayers, and other emergency shelters? What does it say about us when we permit Israel to use Palestinians as human shields by forcing handcuffed civilians, including children and the elderly, to enter potentially booby-trapped tunnels and buildings in advance of Israeli troops, at times dressed in Israeli military uniforms? What does it say about us when we support politicians and soldiers who defend the rape and torture of prisoners? Are these the kinds of allies we want to empower? Is this behavior we want to embrace? What message does this send to the rest of the world? If we do not hold fast to moral imperatives, we are doomed. Evil will triumph. It means there is no right and wrong. It means anything, including mass murder, is permissible. Hope lies with those who resist. The university, it lies in the university encampments, in the occupation of buildings, in the hunger strikes in the streets, and of course in third parties that defy empire. These people who march to the beat of a different drummer are the nation's conscience. A moral stance always has a cost. If there is no cost, it is not moral, it is merely conventional belief. But what price of peace? The radical Catholic priest Daniel Berrigan, who was sent to federal prison for burning draft records during the war in Vietnam, asks. I think of all the good, decent, peace-loving people I have known by the thousands, and I wonder, how many of them are so afflicted by the wasting disease of normalcy that even as they declare for peace, their hands reach out with an instinctive spasm in the direction of their comforts, their home, their security, their income, their future, their plans, that 5-year plan of studies, that 10-year plan of professional status, that 20-year plan of family growth and unity, that 50-year plan of decent life and honorable natural demise. Of course, let us have peace, we cry. But at the same time, let us have normalcy. Let us lose nothing. Let our lives stand intact. Let us know neither prison nor ill repute nor disruption of ties. And because we must encompass this and protect that, and because at all costs, our hopes must march on schedule, and because it is unheard of that in the name of peace a sword should fall, disjoining that fine and cunning web that our lives have woven, because it is unheard of that good men should suffer injustice or families be sundered or good repute be lost, because of this, we cry peace, and there is no peace. There is no peace because there are no peacemakers. There are no makers of peace because the making of peace is at least as costly as the making of war, at least as exigent, at least as disruptive, at least as liable to bring disgrace and prison and death in its wake. The question is not whether resistance is practical. It is whether resistance is right. We are enjoined to love our neighbor, not our tribe. We must have faith that the good draws to it the good, even if the empirical evidence around us is bleak. And the good is always embodied in action. It must be seen. It does not matter if the wider society is censorious. We are called to defy, through acts of civil disobedience and non-compliance, the laws of the state, when these laws, as they often do, conflict with moral law. We must stand, no matter the cost, with the crucified of the earth. If we fail to take this stand, whether against the abuses of militarized police, the inhumanity of our vast prison system, or the genocide in Gaza, we become the crucifiers. Mockery of every sort was added to their deaths. The Roman historian Tacitus wrote of those the Emperor Nero singled out for torture and death. Covered with the skins of beasts, they were torn by dogs and perished, or were nailed to crosses, or were doomed to the flames and burnt, to serve as a nightly illumination when daylight had expired. Sadism by the powerful is the curse of the human condition. It was as prevalent in ancient Rome as it is in Israel. We know the modern face of Nero, who illuminated his opulent garden parties by burning to death captives tied to stakes. That is not in dispute. But who were Nero's guests? Who wandered through the emperor's grounds as human beings, as in Rafah, were burned alive? How could these guests see, and no doubt hear, such horrendous suffering and witness such appalling torture and be indifferent, even content? Who were Nero's guests? We are Nero's guests. And history will judge Israel for this genocide, but it will also judge us. It will ask why we did not do more, why we did not sever all agreements, all trade deals, all accords, all cooperation with a genocidal state, why we did not halt weapon shipments to Israel, why we did not recall our ambassadors, why, when the maritime trade in the Red Sea was disrupted by Yemen, an alternative overland route into Israel was set up by Saudi Arabia and Jordan, why we did not do everything in our power to end the slaughter. And history will condemn us for not heeding the fundamental lesson of the Holocaust, which is not that Jews are eternal victims, but that when you have the capacity to stop genocide and you do not, you are culpable. The opposite of good is not evil, Samuel Johnson wrote. The opposite of good is indifference. The Palestinian resistance is our resistance. The Palestinian struggle for dignity, freedom, and independence is our struggle. The Palestinian cause is our cause. For as history has also shown, those who were once Nero's guests soon become Nero's victims. Thank you.
While we all try to catch our breath, I'm just going to invite folks now to offer some questions of our illustrious keynote speaker. Before we do, can we give another round of applause for Chris Hedges? So we're going to take these three at a time. I've got my partner, Chai Mumesi, also known as the other half of Slum Prophecy. You're going to hear from us on Sunday. He's going to be walking around with a mic for people that have questions, so just go ahead and raise your hand if you've got a question. And we'll take these three at a time to get hopefully through more of them before we have to clear the room shortly after 6.
Okay, I'll take this one. Thank you, Butch. And Reverend Hedges, I just want to say that when I gave my applause just now, it wasn't merely for this presentation, but for your body of work throughout your lifetime. You have been a North Star for many of us, and I appreciate you.
Thank you.
So, as I ponder how this thing might come to a close, I wonder if you envision, in the end, some Nuremberg-style trial. I can't imagine that in the end there isn't going to be some accountability in the same way the Nazi regime was eventually held accountable. What do you see as a potential outcome there?
And we'll take one more. Yeah. Hold on.
Let me come over this way. Yeah, no, I got you. Step over you like that.
Thank you for your inspiring talk. I'm from New York, and it's kind of the center of civil disobedience. I mean, you see people physically with their bodies blocking roads and bridges and cultural institutions and places of work and going to prison in the masses. And it's a breakdown of society at every aspect. And I see this rising of consciousness that is occurring through that. But I'm wondering if there is like a specific tactic that we should all focus on that could really shut down and make that noise that we need that makes us unavoidable to listen to.
So the first question on a Nuremberg-type trial. The problem is that the United States has absented itself from international justice. We still haven't even dealt with the issues of our own genocide, not to mention the enslavement of human beings. We've not confronted those issues. We've not confronted in any real way, and that's why I put in that's from Nick Turse's book, Kill Anything That Moves, which is a very good book on Vietnam. Nick went in and what he did is he found all of the reports of massacres during the Vietnam War in the Army archives that were supposed to be investigated. Most of them, of course, never were. And immediately after he wrote his book, those archives were sealed off. They're not public anymore. So the problem is that the United States has long ago removed itself from accountability for its crimes in Iraq, for its crimes in Afghanistan, and Israel is kind of bonded at the hip with the United States. There are countries where there is no accountability. There are countries like Argentina where there is, South Africa with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So it doesn't always happen. Of course, the problem is that if it doesn't happen, the country calcifies. The Turks to this day have never confronted or even acknowledged the genocide carried out against Armenians. And in fact, every time I write about it, I get letters from the lawyers who work for the Turkish government. What are they going to do, sue me? I don't know. But I always get letters from them, so they're getting salaries. So it doesn't necessarily mean that I think what will happen is Israel will implode from within. Yeshayahu Leibowitz, the great Israeli scholar, predicted all of this in these searing books that he wrote, where he talked about when you build an apartheid state, what you do is you empower the worst elements within that society, the secret police, the prison complex, all this kind of stuff. Herodotus writes about this, where the expansion of the Athenian Empire, Herodotus says the tyranny Athens imposed on others, it finally imposed on itself. Well, that's, of course, happening within the United States. One of the reasons, I was very, very close to the theologian James Cone, most important theologian in America, probably since Reinhold Niebuhr, father of black liberation theology. And I think that our connection was that empire is the external expression of white supremacy. Everything about empire is built on racism. And I saw that in the Middle East, the way soldiers referred to Arabs, sand, the N-word, and all this kind of stuff. So, but all of the mechanisms of control on the outer reaches of empire, they're tested in a way that Israel tests its weaponry on the Palestinians in Gaza. So militarized police, wholesale surveillance, all of that stuff comes back to, because they're disemboweling the country. The figures are staggering. I can't remember the exact figure I quoted. $17 billion we've given to Israel. Our public transportation doesn't work. You still have people from the hurricane who don't have power, what are they going to get, $750 or something? It's absurd, right? Yeah. So it's not a given, but my feeling is that Israel is in such deep distress, and the new generation is going to be a lot less amenable to sustaining. So I think that these despotic regimes can last longer than we like, but in many ways, by sustaining or accelerating the settler colonial project, I think Israel's committing suicide. Whether there's accountability or not, I don't know. In terms of civil disobedience, so the one weapon that we have is the weapon they took away from us, which is the ability to strike. Starting with the 1947 Taft-Hartley Act, it was a very clear assault against unions because that is the real power we have. The way that we can truly disrupt the machinery is through strikes. That civil disobedience, and New York has been great, the Brooklyn Bridge. I was up at Columbia at the encampments. That's fantastic, but you saw over the summer all of the universities collaborate with quote-unquote security firms, or many of them with links, by the way, to Israel, and that's why there's a uniformity. So, no encampments, no flyering. It's just I'm in Princeton, so I was at that encampment quite a bit. And those kids, they occupied one of the halls. They actually went on a hunger strike at Princeton too, but they occupied one of the halls. And those, there were, I think, 12 or 13 students who occupied Clio Hall, the administration building. And boy, they have been told that, if they even breathe the wrong way, they're out. So, but I think that that's an indication of what scares them. They don't have, the Zionists and their supporters don't really have an answer. They have nothing, other than brutish, fascistic violence. And then passing these motions that somehow Zionism is protected speech, and if you criticize, Zionism is racism. I just don't know how, that's, you don't even need to go to college to figure that one out. It's there. And so yeah, they're running scared. Look, everything that we do is, again, as I said, hope is action. Everything that we do, it often seems that it doesn't have an effect. I think sometimes we get frustrated, but I know it does. I was with 133 veterans from the Afghan wars, and we were arrested on the fence of the White House. And when we were being cuffed, it turns out that the police, most of them were in the National Guard, and they'd been to Iraq and Afghanistan, and they would cuff us, and then they'd whisper, "Keep protesting." Now that's not seen from the outside, but it is part of the internal rot. I mean, I covered the revolutions in Eastern Europe. I was in East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Romania. I was in the Magic Lantern Theater every night with Václav Havel. And as Crane Brinton writes in Anatomy of a Revolution, what happens is that a regime becomes so decayed and so corrupt that the foot soldiers will no longer protect it. So in East Germany, I was in Leipzig, and that was the epicenter of the protests in East Germany. Erich Honecker, the communist dictator, sent down an elite paratroop division to fire on the crowd, and when they got there, the local communist authorities blocked the paratroopers from deploying in the streets because their kids were all in the crowds. Honecker lasted another week in power. So I spent a lot of time at Occupy, and my mantra was, don't insult the police. Not that, most of the actual most egregious violence were carried out by the white shirts, not by the blue uniformed cops. And the fact is, most of those cops in New York, they're rent-a-cops when they're not working, $34 an hour, they're off at Goldman Sachs. They hate these people too. But if there is no physical act of resistance, and you're right, New York has been great, then we can't even use the word hope. And I would just close by saying, I spent 7 years covering Gaza. I was a lot of time in Gaza. I've spent a lot of time in the Middle East since October 7th. I'm about to leave again for Doha. I do broadcasting for Al Jazeera out of Doha, both in the Arabic and English service. Palestinians have always, throughout their history, felt abandoned, forgotten, and friendless. And having come out of the Middle East over the last year, these students who have just been there, revered is the only other word for it, revered. So it resonates, even in Gaza. Every act that we carry out, every physical manifestation of resistance, it ripples outward in ways that we often don't see or not aware. When I was in Prague, and I was there in Wenceslas Square in winter, 500,000 Czechs, and Marta Kubasheva, who had been maybe the most famous singer in Czechoslovakia before the overthrow of Dubček and the invasion of the Soviet Union in 1968, she had sung a song called A Prayer for Marta, which was the resistance. That was kind of the song that was embraced by the resistance. And when Dubček was overthrown, she was banned from the airwaves. Her entire recording stock was destroyed. And she had spent the intervening years working on an assembly line in a toy factory. I was in Wenceslas Square when she walked out on that stage, and when she began to sing A Prayer for Marta, every Czech in that crowd knew every word. Mm-hmm. So that line, the good draws to it the good, I stole that from Daniel Berrigan. I asked Daniel Berrigan once, how do you define faith? And he said, the belief that the good draws to it the good. And it does. Yeah.
Before we go to the next round of questions, I'm going to take Chair's prerogative to underline a couple of things that you can either react to or not react to. The first was just a point that Dr. Jill Stein has made repeatedly, which is that recent investigative reporting has made it clear that those uniform sets of guidelines across campuses, including this one at UCSB, including the private Ivy League, that those came directly out of Knesset and are actually in direct violation of US law with respect to Foreign Agents Registration Act, and that if our laws are ever enforced, every email to that effect potentially exposes people to 15 years in prison. That's just worth pointing out. The reason why these university campuses have been so complicit in obedience to the Knesset is relatively straightforward. They are deathly afraid of these student movements. The repression of speech dwarfs McCarthyism in its significance because this is an effort to evade, to squash our constitutionally protected rights of freedom of speech and freedom of assembly, and it is to do so directly to cover for a Holocaust. McCarthyism is comical in comparison to the repression of speech that we are now experiencing. And then the last thing goes back to where you started. In this very classroom once, I did a guest lecture that was about imperialism and the slave trade. And I pointed out that systems of white supremacist domination always provide excellent cover for sociopaths. And they also produce sociopaths. And at the risk of turning every stomach in the room, I'm going to tell one story that a graduate student told me when he was George and Jung, when he was working on German atrocities in Southwest Africa, Namibia. He said that there were surviving reports of, and I'm sorry for everyone who has to hear this, all of the women in a particular village were sexually violated in front of the men of the village, okay? Before then killing the women, before then killing the men. Then going on to kill the children. And to finish the massacre, they played catch with the infants, finishing the games of catch with the bayonets of their rifles. And you mentioned in your talk how academic institutions like this one are complicit in the sanitization of genocidal violence in the way that we write, think, and talk about Vietnam or colonization in Africa. We are the silencer at the end of the imperialist's gun. Because these sanitized versions of history creep into collective consciousness. The last thing that I'll say about this horrifying, particular incident. In these academic institutions, we pretend as though exemplary violence is the only reason why colonial states, whether they're settler colonial states or otherwise, engage in these sorts of orgies of violence. But in the anecdote that I just related to you, no one was left alive to tell the story. Which means there is no exemplary violence function at all. This is murder for sport. And every system of racial supremacism ends in precisely that, because dehumanization at its core will eventually lead to what Chris began his talk with, projects of extermination. We'll take 3 more questions, and then I think we'll be close to time.
Hi. I wanted to ask you a question about the Arabic countries and the Arabic leaders. Leaders like in Jordan, Saudi Arabia, and Egypt. How did they not know that they're next?
Well, they do know they're next. And that's why I was just in Egypt. Sisi, who's pretty draconian as it is, of course, as you know, he's banned all protests, including protests in support of the Palestinians. He's thrown 22 journalists in prison. I spent a day at the Egyptian Press Syndicate, run by this very courageous Egyptian journalists, and the censorship is so severe that the journalists try and post on social media, but the social media sites are shut down within hours. So yeah, they know they're next. I first went to Egypt a year ago, November, because the Egyptian Press Syndicate called for a protest outside of Rafah. And they wanted international journalists to go and protest the exclusion of the foreign press, the banning of the foreign press in Rafah, as well as call for a ceasefire. We never got out. The Muhabarat arrested us before we ever left Cairo. And we were all thrown in jail. And what was particularly disturbing is that the journalists that they went after were the Arab journalists, including beating several of the Egyptian journalists. But they were all asking one question: is your mother Palestinian? Is your father Palestinian? I.e., do you have any Palestinian connection at all? I was in Jordan this summer. My next book is on Gaza, which I'm doing with Joe Sacco, the cartoonist who wrote Palestine, Footnotes in Gaza, which you haven't read, you should go get. Footnotes in Gaza is certainly one of the most important books, I believe, on Palestine. And so I was in Jordan this summer, and the Israeli embassy has been completely vacated in Amman. But in the protests, the protesters are not only surrounding the embassy chanting, "We are all Hamas," but they're denouncing Abdullah. His half-brother is under house arrest, and they were shouting his name. So they know, and they're terrified. And when I was in Cairo again in June, and I had dinner with Gamal Abdel Nasser's former Minister of Information, who Sadat threw in prison for 10 years. Fascinating guy. And he said something I thought that was so true. He said that Israel succeeds not because it's strong, but because the Arab countries are weak. Because if we had a Nasser and a Nehru and a Tito, and of course that's, I was no friend of Saddam, as Butch said, he put a price on my head. It wasn't very high, so it was kind of embarrassing. I wasn't worth much dead. I'm no friend of Saddam, but of course the Israeli government, the Israel lobby pushed us into this disastrous fiasco in Iraq for the same reason they want a war with Iran. They want to break down any country that is is seen by Israel as a rival power. When I was in the West Bank, I was in Ramallah in July. I was visiting my friend Atif Abu Saif, incredible Palestinian novelist. And if you want to read the best stuff on Gaza, get his book, Don't Look Left. It just came out. He's from Gaza, but he lives in Ramallah, but he was in Gaza on October 7th, and he was trapped there for 85 days with his 15-year-old son. And it's a really devastating book. But it just, day by day, it shows you the horror. But we were walking through the streets of Ramallah, and Atif said, if you go into these houses, the pictures are not of Arafat. They're of Saddam. So, yeah, they do know. They do know. What? I know, I worked in it. I mean, he was pretty brutal, and I spent a lot of time with the Kurds, and I was in the Shiite uprising in Basra after the first Gulf War until I was taken prisoner by the Iraqi Republican Guard. I was embedded, I suppose, with the Iraqi Republican Guard. But economically, it was, of course, we destroyed that. Yeah. Modern infrastructure, modern hospitals, a thriving middle class. Yeah.
Yeah, and then bomb them back to the Stone Age is always the approach. It's also the reason why Obama had Gaddafi assassinated, and now we have an actual African slave trade in the destabilized region. So I broke my own chair's rules and let Chris respond to the question. So we're going to take two more, and that will probably have to be our last round, just out of respect. But we can always talk socially outside as we clear the room. So yeah, we've got two already. Thank you.
So, like you touched on in your speak, America has a history of funding dictatorships and genocides around the world, be it in Indonesia, South Vietnam, Argentina, South Africa, etc. But American support for those has always dried up when the American aims were accomplished. But for Israel, no matter how many decades, there never seems to be a clear goal for any of that, and no matter how long it takes to achieve whatever they're trying to achieve, that aid never dries up, it only increases. What do you think America's aim in supporting Israel so strongly is exactly, and will there ever be a time or a movement or anything like that that gets that to dry up like there was for South Vietnam or South Africa?
And we'll take that. Excellent question. Thank you very much. And we'll take the last question here, and then we'll tackle those together.
Yeah, you mentioned in your speech that we didn't learn the lessons from Iraq and other engagements. But if you look at defense stocks, they're at an all-time high. I'm wondering what the involvement in capitalism and the lessons that they're learning is that this is all very profitable. What can we do and to try to turn that ship around?
Well, those are two excellent points. I mean, the problem is that our political system is one of legalized bribery. So the people who pay the most, they're the ones who pick the politicians. I mean, Harris never won a primary vote. Biden, who clearly has serious cognitive issues, which they knew for a very long time and lied to us about for a long time. You know how he got thrown out, because the billionaires said, we're not paying anymore. We're not paying for you anymore because you're going to lose. Well, next thing you know, Harris is the candidate. So that system of legalized bribery has allowed a very well-funded Zionist lobby to essentially, in particular the Congress, buy up the Congress, and anybody like Jamal Bowman or anybody else who challenges the hegemony of the lobby. I think they spent, what is it, either 11 or $14 million to defeat Bowman? Was 14. So that's the problem, that it's not actually in our interest. I mean, it's certainly not globally to fund this genocide, but we're captive to the financial power of the Zionist lobby. We're completely captive. And that's the issue. In the same way that fossil fuel industry, and they own them all. I mean, they're just, it's burlesque. I don't know how people can sit around and take these elections very seriously. Myself, I don't. I mean, it's just vaudeville. I wrote a column called "The Real Choice in This Election is Between the Corporatists and the Oligarchs." That's it. I mean, they have different ends actually, but you have the corporatists gathering around Trump, Elon Musk, and all these figures, and then you have, the oligarchs, and they have oligarchs seek to create chaos because they make profit from it. I mean, that's what private equity funds do. They buy up corporations and harvest them in their terms, so they destroy them. Corporatists, they care about trade deals because they have sweatshops making our clothes in Bangladesh and stuff. So they're different, but that's the choice. You can either vote for the oligarchs or the corporatists. That's it. Either way, we're screwed. Most of my age have taught in the prison system in New Jersey through Rutgers, through the college degree program now for 14 years. My students and their families don't vote. I don't blame them. Biden, Trump, them others, we still run the largest prison system in the world. They're terrorized by militarized police, and terror is the right word. Their doors are kicked down at 3 in the morning in front of their kids for nonviolent drug offenses. They shoot with impunity. They're evicted. Because you lock up the men, you evict the women and children every 6 months. So why vote? It made zero difference in their life. Zero difference to a Palestinian, whether it's Trump or zero. It's what Sheldon Wolin, the political philosopher, calls inverted totalitarianism. That's the system we live under. And it's like the late Roman Republic. You still have a facade, but internally, the elites, the financial elites, have their hands on every level of power. So, I haven't voted for a Democrat since 2000. I was Ralph Nader's speechwriter. And then your question, well, yeah, of course, you're right. The defense, the arms industry, that and the public relations industry, I haven't decided which is more evil. But the arms industry, if we could curb the international arms trade, or we could nationalize or something. But yeah, of course, they have, as soon as, I think there's pretty good evidence that, because the internal, Washington Post published the Afghan documents, the Afghan logs, which were leaked to them, which we knew years before that we were not going to win in Afghanistan. But Raytheon and Halliburton, they're making a fortune. And as soon as Afghanistan was over, they got Ukraine. Now they've got Gaza. It's all, so you're right. But it's that fusion of the weapons industry with the Zionists that makes them such a powerful force. And yeah, I don't think that what we're doing, I don't think it's in our interest. I don't think it's even in Israel's interest, ultimately, to do what they do. But these are extremely powerful forces. We've had efforts, I mean, more in the UK, shutting down Elbit systems. But I just came from London. My friend Roger Hallam, who founded Extinction Rebellion, just got a 5-year prison sentence. Roger was on a Zoom call, and they were planning the shutdown of the M25 motorway, which surrounds London, which they did for 4 days. Roger wasn't even there at the event, but this is Roger's, I think, 7th time in prison. I did a fundraiser for him in London, and then I went and saw him in prison. But what we are seeing with both the climate activists and the activists on behalf of the Palestinians against the genocide is that, and we've seen this in the universities, they're just becoming harsher and harsher and harsher. So Roger got 5 years, and the other 4 members, this was with a group called Just Stop Oil, got 4 years each in prison for nonviolent civil disobedience. And meanwhile, the fascist rioters who were attacking immigrants, walked out of the court.
Let's give Chris Hedges another round of applause. We will be back in action tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. at Buchanan Hall. The room is 1910, and we will have our first panel on reparations, restorative justice, and politics in California. So this is a panel that's defined around local politics, local social struggles. We've got a program throughout the day. I encourage everyone to go to endofempire.xyz, and the full program is there. If you go endofempire.xyz/schedule, you'll see where and when everything is. Tell your friends, the Friday opening keynote's always a little light on attendance. Let's get these numbers up, tell everybody to come out for the weekend's festivities. And then, of course, Sunday, we've also got a full day of activities, concluding with a concert and keynote address by Dr. Jill Stein. Thank you guys for coming out. Really appreciate you. Let's give yourselves a round of applause. And then we can mingle socially, but we have to be out of this room. So.